Today is week 15 of our Gospel of John series. We've been working through the book of John, and today is a special day because today is what we would call on our church calendar Palm Sunday. It is the Sunday right before Easter, and we get that phrase, Palm Sunday, from what we studied when we read through John chapter 12. It was the Sunday before Jesus rose from the dead. He came into Jerusalem with the intention of dying, but also celebrating Passover with all of the other Jews that came into Israel. And when he came in, everyone was waving palm branches because they thought he was coming in as a king to free them from the Roman Empire that had conquered them and was ruling them at the time. But he came in to bring a different kind of freedom, and the people kind of completely missed that. So today we're celebrating Palm Sunday. And on our church calendar, that's not only the most important date, this entire week has a really important significance. This has historically been referred to as Passion Week. And the reason why that is because after Jesus rode into Jerusalem on Sunday, from Monday all the way through Thursday night, all kinds of stuff was happening. He was traveling around, he was teaching, he was in the city, he was having conversations with people, he was talking with Pharisees, he was having conversations with his disciples. People are wanting to come and see him because he's in Jerusalem. And we read what happened from Monday all the way through Thursday, these last few weeks. We've recorded the messages, they're online if you want to go back and listen to them. But we have essentially covered John chapter 13 through 17, which is everything that happened Sunday afternoon up until Thursday night, with the exception of after dinner. So we are, in our timeline, Jesus is just a few hours away from being hung on the cross, like probably 12 hours or less from being arrested and being hung on the cross. That's where we are in our timeline, and that's where we are in the book of John. So in our study tonight, we're going to start right after dinner, what is referred to as the Last Supper. It was kind of Jesus' way of celebrating Passover with his disciples, even though it was not technically the Passover meal that was going to happen on Friday night. But the thing you need to understand about the Jewish culture is they count days when the sun goes down. So technically, when the sun goes down Thursday night, according to the Jew, Passover starts to begin. But their Passover meal, traditionally as a family, they all celebrated on Friday, which was the Sabbath. So Jesus ate his meal with his disciples Thursday night because he knew what was coming his way. But that's important to know because that's one of the reasons why the Jews wanted a speedy trial, because they wanted to put Jesus in the grave and then go eat their Passover meal, which is ironic because he's essentially the lamb that was slain for all mankind. He was the Passover lamb. And the poetic irony of having to slaughter the sacrifice before you can have the festival is something that was completely lost on the Jewish people, but I don't want it to be lost on you. So what we're going to do is we're going to read through today John chapter 18 and 19. I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to read some sections of it so you get a good understanding of where Jesus is being brought to, why he's being brought there, and what is happening to him. So everything, like I said, is going to take place from Thursday night after dinner to about Friday afternoon when Jesus is buried. But before I begin, I want to read to you something from John 13, which is about 2 weeks ago, just to refresh your memory because it's important as we go into the chapters today. So this is John 13, verses 36 through 38. You can turn there if you want. We'll throw it up on the screen, and I'll just read it to you. It says this: Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" This is Peter saying to Jesus. And Jesus answered, "Where I'm going, you cannot follow me, but you will follow afterward." And Peter said to him, "Lord, why can't I follow you now?" And he says, "I will lay down my life for you." So Peter's making this bold statement in front of everybody so everybody can see, hey, Jesus, I'm the most dedicated out of all these guys. I want to follow you everywhere. I'll lay my life down for you. And Jesus' response for him, "You're going to lay your life down for me? Question mark. Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. So right at this, this is before what we're about to read here. This is during the dinner. Peter is making a big, bold statement. Look, Jesus, I'm with you. I'm for you. I'll defend you. I'll go down to death with you. And Jesus looks at him and says, "Peter, you're going to deny me before the sun comes up tomorrow morning." I just want you to remember that because his words are going to be really important as we get into John chapter 18 because he's going to regret those words. So John chapter 18, I'm going to pick up in verse 1, and let's read a little bit, talk a little bit. John chapter 18, verse 1, it says this: When Jesus had spoken these words, so this was at the end of the dinner, this is where we're picking up. he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. Now, this is the Garden of Gethsemane. You probably remember this from some of the other accounts in Matthew and so on. Judas, who betrayed him, also knew this place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So one of Jesus' disciples, Judas, knew where they always met, and he was going to use this piece of information to betray him. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests. Now, how much is that? Now, I've read some different commentaries on how many guys this is. A band of soldiers could be anything as small as just a couple of guys. But a lot of the commentaries I read actually said if you go by the strict interpretation of what a band of soldiers was, and this tied to the Greek, this could be as high as 1,000 guys coming to arrest Jesus. Now, I have a hard time wrapping my head around that. But if you think about how many times Jesus escaped, it's not hard to believe the fact that they wanted to go overboard to get this guy and take care of him before the Passover. Because just about a week and a half before, he raised Lazarus from the dead. And we can't have people going around raising people from the dead. That disturbs all, where do we even start? We can't have that. So we got to get rid of people like that. So Judas, having procured this many people, some officers and the chief priests and the Pharisees, went with lanterns and torches and weapons. And then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, so they're having a little showdown. They're in there praying, and this band of guys walk up. Jesus says to them, "Whom do you seek?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. And when Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Now, what does that mean? It means exactly what it says. When he said, "I am he," and if you take the Greek interpretation of "I am he" and you tie it up with what he would have said probably in Hebrew, he would have said essentially the same thing that the fiery bush said to Moses, "I am that I am." The moment those words left his mouth, everybody fell to the ground. Because just the power of Jesus' words is enough to take down a 1,000-man army. I think John is including this because he wants us to understand that nobody took Jesus without Jesus letting them take him. You don't take down the King of Kings. It's just not possible. He has more authority and power in his voice than any army you can muster. And the only way they killed this guy is because he freely laid his life down. That's what is on the line here. Jesus freely chose to give up his life in your place to take the punishment that was coming your way, but that's coming later. So all of these guys fell to the ground. So he said to them again, and I imagine while they're on the ground trying to get up, and it's 1,000 guys, and they're all in their full armor, and it was probably made a big loud noise. I mean, if you're ever at a restaurant and you hear back in the kitchen, people drop pots and everybody turns, take that and magnify it times like 1,000, right? All these guys are on the ground, they're on their rear ends, and they're trying to stand up, and Jesus says to them, "Who do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus from Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." And he said this to fulfill the word that was spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I lost not one." Jesus is trying to make sure he's fulfilling prophecy that they're not taking any of the disciples. They're all fine. They're only there for him. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus, for those of you who play at home. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" And at this point, we're all standing back going, "Come on, Peter, my man, doing what needs to get done. Taking out his sword and cutting off ears of dudes." Like, I'd like to think that that's where we would be, right? Like, at Jesus' side, you're not taking my king, ear. That's mine now. But Jesus' response is, look, this is a cup that the Father's given me. I've got to drink this. Put your sword away. That's not what we're here for. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. And it was Caiaphas who had advised just a few chapters before that that it would be expedient just for one man to die for the people. Now, let's pause right there, because John's account of this story leaves out some pretty important things that some of the other writers of the gospel stories included. Some really key points, like the time where Jesus, just before this happened, is so overwhelmed and in excruciating pain in his prayer time that he begins to sweat, and blood vessels in his skin burst, and he starts sweating blood. He's praying, and he's so overwhelmed that in the middle of this prayer time, he starts sweating blood. But what is apparent and very clear in this, aside from the fact that Jesus is sweating blood, is that John calls attention to this idea of Judas betraying him. He says it twice, the one who betrayed him, the great betrayal. And this doesn't end here. This is a big moment in church history, because actually in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23, Paul makes reference to this night, and he doesn't call it the night our king was arrested or the night he was crucified. He calls it the night of the great betrayal. So this concept of betrayal is a big deal in early church history, and it was a big deal because Judas was a disciple. He was a guy that spent 3 years with these guys. They looked at him like a brother, and he's the one who went and sold Jesus out. He lived with these guys for so long and followed Jesus everywhere. And so the early church, the guys who walked with him, saw this as like the worst thing that you could possibly do, a huge betrayal. It was an out in the open kind of a thing. I turned my back on my king. Now, betrayal is not just a big deal here, it's a big deal in the entire Bible, because if you boil all of the stuff that the Bible is about, one of the reasons why Jesus came is to address the issue of betrayal. Somebody who turns their back on you, somebody who you thought was your friend, somebody who you thought was looking out for your best interest, but betrayed you. Betrayal was really what was at the heart of Adam in the garden. God said, you're my creation, you're my friend, I want to walk with you and talk with you. Just don't do that one thing. And then Adam does the one thing. He betrays what God asks him to do. Betrayal is the thing that made Israel want to build a golden calf. Betrayal is the thing that led King David to killing Bathsheba's husband so he could have this wife that was married to somebody else. Betrayal is the thing that killed Jesus because of Judas. In the Bible, all sin is viewed as a betrayal against God, and it has to be punished. God says, I'm the dad who created this world. This is all my family, and I set the rules in my house. And you have a responsibility as my kids to follow my rules, not set your own rules because you think I'm not watching. You have a responsibility to follow mine, and when you break my rules, there's a punishment coming your way. Jesus came to take your punishment. That's what this is about. That's one of the biggest reasons why Jesus came, to address the issue that you, in your accounts before God, was in the red. You have broken the rules. You have become selfish. You have chosen yourself rather than others. You have made decisions that at some level have broken one or many of the rules that God has set up for this creation that he has built. And it's created inside of you, in your account, a deficit. You are coming up short, and there is punishment coming your way. You have broken the law. But God said, I love you so much that I don't want to keep you from me. I'm going to send somebody to pay that punishment for you. They're going to do the time instead of you doing the time. They're going to take the punishment instead of you taking the punishment. It is very important that you understand that, because the whole concept of Jesus taking your place rests on the understanding that you have a great debt in the eyes of the guy who created you. If you don't understand that, then there's no other ground we can stand on. There's no common ground. There has to be an understanding that because of my choices, I am in the wrong, not him. He doesn't need to change his way of doing things because he made everything. He made me. I have a responsibility to follow his pattern and the way he does things. And so when we're out of alignment, he's not the one that's got to change. I am. And there is a punishment coming my way because I choose to do things my way and not his way. Jesus shows up and says, you may not even be aware of the punishment that's coming your way, but I am, and I'll take it for you. And all I need in return is for you to accept that my punishment, the one that I took, was meant for you. And you are now clean in the eyes of God. There is nothing more that you need to do in order to make God pleased with you. I have done it all by the sacrifice that I have made. Now, in the coming verses, we're going to talk about what this punishment meant, what he actually took on for your self-righteousness, for the racism that lives deep in your heart, for the bigotry that you live with, for the way that you think about people, for the way that you treat situations and manipulate them so you can get the upper hand. All of that, he took the punishment we're about to read about. And all of it satisfies your punishment for the betrayal that you've had against God. Now, at this point, you might be saying, all right, I don't really see my betrayal. I understand the concept of like sin, but when I read this story, and I'm not really thinking, man, I'm team Judas. I'm team Peter. I'm over here with Peter. I'm the sword guy. I'm the cutting off ear guy. Don't get in my way. And this might be a pattern for your life. You have a really hard time seeing your own betrayal and your own sin, but man, you are really good at spotting it in others, right? You're the kind of person who in a message like this, you're like, man, I wish so-and-so was here. They really should be listening to this. You have a really easy time spotting it in others, but for yourself, you're saying, not me, I'm not Judas, I'm team Jesus, I'm with Peter. I would have been with him at the table saying, I'm never gonna leave you. I would have been right there next to him with the sword. In public, I'm making bold declarations about the way I feel about Jesus. But I think that it's important for us to continue the story and find out where Peter lays, or where he falls. Because for most of us, we're thinking, yeah, there's some Judases out there, and I know who some of them are. And they're the betrayers. But as we're about to find out, it's not just Judas who betrays Jesus. Let's go to verse 15 here. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now, a lot of commentaries think that this disciple is probably John. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. This is the reason why people think it's John, because John's background was Sadducee. He had some religion in his background when he met Jesus. He's got some friends in high places. But Peter stood outside at the door. So Peter's outside, and this disciple is inside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter inside. So this other disciple, probably John, is doing Peter a solid. Hey, why don't you come inside? I've got some clout. Just follow me in. So the servant girl at the door said to Peter, hey, you also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? And he said, I'm not. Now, this is just probably 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes after Judas betrayed him. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's an hour. An hour ago, everyone's like, Judas, how could you? Such a horrible guy. And some servant girl, not even an army, some servant girl. Hey, weren't you one of his? Nope, never met the guy. Don't know him. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves, and Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Now, I want you to jump down to verse 25. Simon Peter was standing outside warming himself, and they said to him, hey, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? And he denied them, saying, I'm not. And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter cut off. Oh man, isn't that the way it goes? It's always the relative of somebody's ear that you cut off. That's always how it goes. says, did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter again denied Jesus and then immediately heard the rooster crow. Now, when do roosters crow? When the sun starts coming up. So by this time, it's early morning. So it was late night. Maybe even early, like almost like 1 a.m. When they're in the garden, this whole thing goes down. And then they're bringing Jesus back and forth to Caiaphas, to Annas, to Pilate. And they're doing this whole thing where they're bringing him different places because at this point, like, the Jews don't have the authority to kill anybody, but they want to build a case before they bring him before Pilate, who is the governor. And they're trying to make a decision. All right, we got to get this guy killed, but we got to have the right things to say before Pilate. And in the middle of all of that nonsense, Peter is standing outside warming himself by a fire, and nobodies are saying, weren't you with him? And he's saying, I don't know him. Never. So look, there's one kind of betrayal, like Judas's betrayal, where it is overt and you sell out Jesus and everybody thought you were with him, but you compromise because maybe money. Or you compromise because you really want what you want and you don't care the impact it has on other people. But there's another kind of betrayal where you're just like, deep in your heart, you really, really, really do love Jesus, but your love is just so weak that you're a coward in front of others. Both of those betrayals, it's just two different sides of the same coin. It's all betrayal. So you may be standing here thinking, well, I'm not Judas betrayal. But are you Peter betrayal? Are you the kind of guy who publicly, when you're in church, man, you're raising your hands, you're making a big deal about Jesus. Every time people see you, you're talking about him. But when you're at work, nobody even knows you're a Christian? Do your neighbors know that you're believers? When was the last time you witnessed to somebody or told them about the way that Jesus has transformed your life? Can you even make a bulleted list of the ways that Jesus has transformed your life? Are you even mindful enough of seeing the things that he has done? Do you even know what he's done? Are you just wandering through life just kind of like, well, I guess I'm in a pretty good spot. Thanks, God? Or are you locked in on Jesus and what he's doing for you? That's the difference, because one is this backhanded, I never really loved you in the first place. I was just playing this religious game and I had everybody fooled. But the other side of it is, no, I really do love Jesus, but I'm a coward. I'm weak. My love is so weak. I bring this up because this kind of rebellion still rules our life. And we think that, man, we are way more committed than we actually are. And we'd say things like, man, I'll go anywhere and I'll do anything for you, Jesus. But when it comes down to it, all we do is really just make excuses. We compromise on our convictions. As soon as the pressure comes on, we think that we're different than Judas, but this whole concept of betrayal is real in our life. I bring all of this up today because even though we are guilty of betrayal, even though you may not be a Judas and you're a Peter, we're publicly making a big deal about Jesus and you really do love him, but when everyone is putting pressure on you, you compromise. Whatever side of the coin you're on, betrayal is a real thing in your life. Sin is a thing that's still trying to tether you to this earth. I have good news for you. And the good news is, even though you betrayed him and you've turned your back on him and you were like a Judas or like a Peter who publicly are making a big deal, but you can't even stand up to a servant girl, it is true that you are weak. The good news is that Jesus has always been and will always be more faithful than you. See, if this entire salvation thing was based off of your ability to achieve and be successful and stay faithful, I have bad news for you. You're not going to make it. But the good news is that this love relationship that we have with God is not based off of your capacity to do anything. It's based off of your response from Jesus' capacity to do everything. My response is I love him and I study his word and I pray and I worship as a response to what he has already done. Not to conjure up and get something going so that God will look at me like I'm worth his affection, his attention. The response that I give as worship and prayer comes from the knowledge that he has already done everything that ever needs to be done for all time. He was sacrificed once for all, and the punishment he took to satisfy my account is something that never needs to be brought up again because it's settled. That's the good news. Jesus is more faithful than you are. He knows how small your faith is. He understands how it buckles under pressure. He knows your joy is still at times tied to things in this world, but he is committed to resurrecting you and empowering you so that you are transformed and you don't look like you used to. Now, let's go back to what he endured, because that's what's going to cover for the rest of this. For the rest of 18 through verse 28 through like 40, Jesus is moved from leader to leader. And the reason why they're doing this is because the mob is trying to get a case together to bring before Rome in order to get him killed, because the way that the law works is only Rome can kill people. Rome let the Jews kind of govern themselves up to a specific point. So they had religious leaders, they had lawyer-type leaders, and this group of people brought Jesus before Caiaphas, before Annas, and these were the religious leaders of the day, and they're essentially indicting him and saying that you are a blasphemer, you have said that you are God, and we're not cool with that, and the punishment for that is death. Now, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to bring you before Rome, and they're going to have to make sure that they side with us. So what they do is they bring him to this guy named Pilate, and Pilate is the governor of this region. But Pilate, when they get to him, doesn't really want to deal with this issue because he is intimidated by the Jews. Just a little quick background on Pilate. Pilate has a history since he's gotten here to be governor over this area of clashing with the Jewish people constantly. As soon as he got there, one of the first things he did was he brought an image of the emperor into the city, and the Jews went nuts. They went crazy. We are not having any of that. So the next thing he does is he starts bringing in these shields with the Roman symbol, and he tries to set them up inside the temple, and the Jews go nuts. They lose their mind. So the next thing he tries to do a couple years later is he tries to pull some of the money out of the treasury from the temple to pay for the aqueducts that have got to be built up under the city. And the Jews go nuts. They lose their mind over that. And then after that, he takes this idea of like, all right, well, we need some coins in the region. And so we're gonna make Roman coins, but we're going to stamp them with pagan symbols. And so you guys are going to have to exchange money with pagan symbols on it. And as you guessed it, the Jews went nuts. They lost their minds. So up to this point, Pilate has had quite a few losing battles. And at some point, he is actually even sent in the middle of these crowds and people revolting and raising a ruckus about things like the coins. He's actually sent some of his soldiers out into the crowd to just start killing people, just to keep them at bay and just to keep the fear in them. So he doesn't want to deal with this issue. So this rowdy bunch of Jewish people have brought Jesus before Pilate, and Pilate is trying to reason with the Jews. He does a couple things. First of all, he tries to reason when he's like, look, this is not my thing. You guys go deal with this. And their response is, no, we want him dead, and Roman law says that we've got to have your approval, so we're not leaving. And he's like, all right, well, what's the deal? Let me meet with them. So he talks with him a little bit, and he comes out and he says, look, I don't see any fault with this guy. I'll tell you what, you have a custom on Passover to let one person go who's been sentenced to death. How about we let this guy named Barabbas go? Or instead of Jesus dying, how about we just put him in his place? Is that good? And everybody's like, no, let Barabbas go. We want Jesus dead. So Pilate tries something else, and that's where we get into chapter 19. So go to verse 1 in chapter 19. This is Pilate's kind of like last chance. So Pilate then took Jesus and he flogged him. Now, what is flogging? He beat him. Now, beating is kind of just like a light word. Let me just really quickly explain. Maybe you've heard this before, but what they beat him with was this thing called the cat of nine tails, and it was like this long leather rope, and at the end of every single one of these 9 braided pieces of leather and rope were sewn in like edges of bone and glass and clay. And so what they would do is when they would beat him, they would rip into his back, and then all of these like little stone pieces and glass pieces, metal pieces, they would just stick into his back and they would rip it back. And they just gave him these lashings after lashings. And what it did is just ripped his back open to the point where his muscles are exposed. They braid this like crown of thorns and they shove it on his head. And they just beat him to the point where you can't even hardly recognize him. So when it says flog, that's what that means. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. Purple is the color of royalty. And they came up to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands and they're mocking him and beating him. And Pilate went out and said to him, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." And when the chief priests and the officers saw them, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no guilt in him." And Jews answered, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." And when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. And he entered his quarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from, my dude? Where are you from? Why are these people losing their minds? Aren't you just a guy?" And Jesus gave him no answer. And Pilate starts getting a little worked up. And he said to him, "Are you not going to speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" And Jesus looks up at him and says, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." So what Pilate does as his last effort is he beats Jesus senseless. He puts him in a situation where you can hardly even recognize him and displays him for the crowd. And he says, "Look at this guy's humiliation. This guy looks like a clown. How can any of you guys take this guy seriously? None of you people can honestly say, this guy is a king. Look what I was able to do to him. Will you let him go now?" And the crowd shouts, "No, crucify him." And it's at this point where we see the final betrayal before Jesus is killed. Judas betrayed him, Peter betrayed him, and now God's people are rejecting God. Now let's take a moment to zoom in on this conversation between Jesus and Pilate, because Pilate is trying to avoid making a decision here. And he's pleading with the crowd, and he tries to reason with Jesus, and Jesus says, "Look, Pilate, the only reason that we're here is because I've got a mission that my dad sent me on." Now, the greater sin is the Hebrews because they're the one who are betraying and turning their back on their God. But you also have fault here because, look, nothing you would have if it wasn't for God giving it to you. Now, this is the conversation that a lot of people who say, "I don't want any part of Jesus, I don't believe in him," non-believers, this is the same kind of conversation they would have. For most people in the world, they don't want to have to make a decision about Jesus. And I understand that. The reason why is because once you do, then you have to start submitting your life to the way that he tells you to run it and not the way that you think it should be run. And that's the rub. I get that. I totally understand that. Submitting to him means you don't get to make your own choices. It means you do what he tells you to do. Most people just want to live their lives. They want to be happy. They don't want to have to make a decision about Jesus. They don't like being put into a position where they have to be making a decision about Jesus. But this conversation teaches us something really important about the world. You don't get that option. As much as we would like to think that you can just go your life not making a decision about Jesus, at some point you are going to have to decide what you think about the man who says, "I'm God and I have the power to do whatever I see my Father telling me to do." You cannot be indifferent about a guy who says, "I'm God," because he's either crazy, he didn't exist, or he actually is who he says he is. You're going to have to make a decision about what he says about himself. And Pilate is in this position. I don't want to make a decision. I like the way my life is. And Jesus says, I understand that, but everything you have comes from the Father above. You're in a position where God has already done everything for you. You're here because he said you could be here. And you're going to have to make a decision about what Jesus says about himself for your life. Everybody has to make a decision about what they're going to do with Jesus. So the question is, what does Pilate do? Well, he gives into the betrayal of God's people. Let's pick up in verse 16. We're going to start wrapping it up here. Verse 16, it says, so he delivered them over to be crucified, and they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him with two others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross, and it read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, some early church tradition actually records that Pilate and his wife, sometime after this, actually became believers. And it's interesting, if that's true, how some of these situations that he was put in may have led to his decision about what he decided about Christ. Many of the Jews read the description for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic and in Latin and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, don't write the King of the Jews. Maybe write, this man said, I'm King of the Jews. And Pilate said, look, I've written what I've written. This is done. I'm not dealing with this anymore. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts. 1 part for each soldier. Also his tunic, but the tunic was seamless, woven from one piece to another. So they said to one another, let's not tear it, but let's cast lots for it, see who it will be. And this was to fulfill the scripture that says, they divided my garments among them, for my clothing they cast lots. See, in the Old Testament, there was prophecy that all this was going to happen. So the soldiers did the things, but standing by the cross of Jesus, where his mother and his sister and Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother and the disciples whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour forward, the disciples took her to his own home. I want you to look at the scene of the cross here, because at this scene, there are guilty people on either side of Jesus. There are broken people, like Mary and his mom, who are seeing the situation for what it is. And there's also Roman soldiers who are trying to make $1 off of this event. This is a great picture of the modern day church. There are sinners. There are people who are genuinely broken over the work of God. And then there's people who are trying to make money in the middle of it. But the good news is that Jesus died for all of them. He was on that cross taking the punishment for all of it. Jesus took the punishment for your betrayal. And no matter how faithful or weak you are, Jesus loves you, and you have to make a decision about that reality. What do you say about Jesus? Now let's read the end of this where he's buried. I want to pick it up in verse 38. It says, after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews. Man, how many of those were around? Asked Pilate that he might take away the blood of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes. It was about 75 pounds in weight. So they took the body of Jesus, bound it in linen clothes with spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. And now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a new tomb that nobody had been laid in. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, that was Passover, since the tomb was close at hand, they went ahead and laid Jesus there. So by Friday afternoon of this week, our King would have been placed in a tomb. He was dead. And that evening, as the sun started to set, all of the Jews celebrated Passover, which, as we've talked about, is the Jewish festival where on the 10th plague, Israel was free from the bondage of Egypt because God spared Israel the death of the firstborn. And I can just imagine Mary trying to celebrate Passover, having her firstborn taken from her. This is a tragic, tragic story. And there would be no happy ending if it wasn't for what happened next. Because we are told, as we will cover next week, that this is not the end of the story. Something happens 3 days later that changes Mary, it changes disciples, and it's the reason why every single one of you are in this room today. Jesus came to take the punishment for your betrayal, but he also came to bring you into God's family and include you in this abundant life that he wants you to be a part of. And that is the promise that comes to all who make a decision that say, Jesus is who he says he was, and I will choose to serve him instead of trying to make my own way in this life. Let's pray.